we did have over 900 people vote here, which was good, which also meant we had 20 of the New Testaments that were taken, and a bunch of tracts and different things. As I set them all out, people walk by, so the word uses it.
Yeah, thankfully, there are many polling places that take place in church buildings. Hopefully, some of those other places have an effect too, that people can pick up literature. People can become aware of information that they need spiritually. Well, good morning to all of you. Welcome to our study in the Gospel of Luke. We are in Luke chapter 8. If you aren't there already, welcome to Luke chapter 8. We are coming to the end of this chapter. We've covered a lot of material, a lot of events, a lot of teaching in this chapter 8. And so we were in the middle of something last time. So let's go back to the beginning of this particular section, this event, which is back in verse 40. So Luke 8:40. And as Jesus returned, and remember this is returning from the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus cast out the legion of demons from the man, and now they're taking the boat back across the sea to Capernaum, which is Jesus' home base of operations. The people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, just on the verge of womanhood, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. They were choking him with the amount of people that were in those narrow streets. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, the same amount of time that the only daughter had been alive, and could not be healed by anyone, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. The fringe of his cloak would have been the tassels hanging down, which was put on every day by every Jewish man to remind him of keeping of God's law. Verse 45, and Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And that's where we begin today. Verse 45, who touched me? Why did Jesus ask this? Was he ignorant of who it was that touched him? Well, we initially would say no, he was not, because he is God, but at the same time, he had human restrictions that he voluntarily took upon himself. So it is possible that he did not know who it was. But even if he didn't know the who, was that why he asked the question? It's likely that he asked the question because he desired that the woman be exposed to the crowd, not for her shame, but for his glory and for the commendation of her faith. Why did Jesus make such a big deal out of this? This was actually important for her. It was necessary for her to recognize that she had not been healed by a good luck charm. If I can just touch it, it's kind of a superstitious idea, but by the personal power of Jesus because of her faith. That was important for her to recognize, and for the crowd as well. So Jesus stops in this huge crowd on his way to the house of Jairus, whose daughter is dying. He stops in order to find out who touched him. How silly that certainly seemed to those around, and how much to the consternation of the girl's father. Can you imagine him? He's trying to hurry things along. We recently took our youngest grandchildren to Oh, what's that place called?
Phoenix.
No, to the animal place.
It's safari.
Animal Safari?
Keystone Safari.
Keystone Safari in Grove City. And I think it's the first time that 2-year-old Isla had ever been to a place like that. But it was so funny. We got in there, we're walking, we walk up to the first exhibit, we're looking at the animal there. And before we know it, she's saying, okay, we got to keep going. Well, I can imagine the father saying, okay, Jesus, we got to keep going. We can't wait to find out who touched you. But it doesn't say anything, at least according to the text here. And everyone's denying it. I didn't touch it. It wasn't me. We weren't touching you. And Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you. So Peter, with his normal impetuousness, proceeds to dispute with Jesus over the practicality of finding out who it was that touched him. Can you hear the tone in Peter's voice? He calls him master. That's not the normal word used by Peter or the disciples. He doesn't call him Lord here. He calls him, or even rabbi, teacher, he calls him master. And reiterates that the people are pressing in on him like grapes. The same word used for pressing grapes. You can imagine what that was like. You've been in a huge crowd, maybe at Christmas time. Verse 46, but Jesus said, someone did touch me. And of course, he's not talking about the kind of jostling around, the pressing in of people. He's talking about a particular touch because he says, for I was aware that power had gone out of me. I was aware, the word there is sometimes translated know, I know, and it's the word gnosko, which means that he had a knowledge by personal experience. He just didn't know something by fact. He knew it by an experience that he had, and that experience was that he had felt power going out of him. Now, we might wonder at that. When Jesus healed, was there actually a transfer of power? I mean, we kind of associate that with science fiction movies and things like that, where people have power and you can maybe even see it being generated and moving from person to person. But this is not the only time we have seen this expression. Back in chapter 6, verse 19, remember the Sermon on the Plain? Just prior to that, it says this, and all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. So it wasn't just Jesus saying to people, you're healed. Apparently, even prior to this, there were people that were being healed just by touching him. And we see such a thing later with some of the apostles as well. Bob Utley comments, apparently Jesus's physical healing of others took something out of him. So there was a sense that something was going out. And the only thing I can compare it to is when you are teaching God's word. And if you are really in tune with what the Lord is saying through his word, that there is a sense in which there's a lack or a depletion, let's say, of energy. I think Brian or anybody who has preached very much will tell you that afterwards there is a tiredness, an exhaustion sometimes even, depending on what the message has been about. And so he had a sense of power had gone out of him. All right, any comments to that point or questions up through verse 46?
I think a lot of places in the Bible, we have a tendency to think of these things happening individually and, just a slow mo revealing of Christ. But I think here you get the fluidity of what his life was like.
Yeah.
People, wow, Ron, I'm pressing, hitting him. Somebody saying my daughter's dying, running, another woman catching him from another side. And just thinking, is any man, because he was fully man and fully God, how exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, this guy must have slept like a log.
Well, just not too long before this, we had him sleeping in a boat in the midst of a windstorm.
Yeah, it was anything but a casual existence like we know in America.
Mhm.
This was just. You know, thinking of Palestinians, I'm thinking running around chanting and rioting and just these people following them. And now you know why the Romans and the Jews were so afraid of them.
Mhm.
This is, one of the few.
Yeah, this was a
passages
guy
that
who
really
could gather
captures
a
this.
crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was exhausting to him. Yeah, good point. Any others? All right, verse 47. When the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, why was she trying to escape notice? Yeah, exactly. Remember last week we talked about the fact that due to her constant bleeding, she was unclean, ceremonially unclean. There was nothing necessarily wrong with her as far as, she's a terrible person, but according to the Mosaic law, that made her ceremonially unclean, and anyone who touched her or would be ceremonially unclean as well, and couldn't participate in the temple activities or even the synagogue. So she was trying to escape being noticed, but she saw that Jesus was insistent. He wasn't going to go on until he found out who touched him. And so she came trembling. She came trembling again, because she's not supposed to be there in that crowd. And in addition, she may have felt afraid because of the guilt that she experienced at having sinned against the Lord by acting without his knowledge. Take that into consideration. She faced the widest publicity for her secret cure by coming forward. She came trembling and fell down before him. We've had a number of cases in recent weeks where someone has fallen down before Jesus. And sometimes it's simply in recognizing, as the demons did, that he is a superior to them. Sometimes it was in worship. Sometimes it was in fear. In this case, we're told that she's trembling. And so it may have been in part fear and part worship. We don't know for certain, but she fell down in at least humility before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. It was important for the woman to be acknowledged publicly in Jesus's mind as being healed, not only for her benefit, as I mentioned before, to understand that it was her faith in him that caused the healing, not any kind of superstitious belief, but also so that she could be received back in society and to temple services. Because if there's not a proclamation of her healing, then the process would be a somewhat lengthy one before she would be able to be back in society again. So Jesus is doing this primarily for her, it would seem to me. Any questions or comments about that? About verse 47?
So something that jumped out to me, and I have a relative who's a feminist, and she often will make comments about Christianity and how women are treated poorly and just backhanded stuff here and there. But when you see this and you see how much Jesus cared for her and the woman at the well, it blows my mind how people can think otherwise. So he obviously loved her.
Yeah. Well, if you have to ask these people, have you ever read the Bible?
Yeah.
Or are you just taking what people tell you? Verse 48. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Now, why did Jesus use this term? It's the only time he uses it in the Gospels. Why does he call her daughter? If she's had this condition for 12 years, she's not young. I mean, not real young anyway. She's a mature woman, probably, most likely, very likely older than Jesus, but he calls her daughter. a word that would more exactly pertain to the girl he's going to see. But he calls this woman daughter.
That's her faith makes her a child of God.
I think that's it. Yeah. Because what does he say following that? Your faith has made you well. Literally, the word there has saved you. And I wish that the translation, I don't know, maybe any translation have saved you. I wish they would leave it ambiguous so that we could sometimes see the double meanings that are there. Because I don't know that he is specifically limiting himself or what happened to her physical healing. Your faith has saved you. It's your faith, not your physical touch, it's your faith. And I think he may be at least intimating a spiritual salvation, a spiritual wholeness as well.
I have a side note for the word whole.
Yeah, it has made you whole, which is maybe something more than just the physical. Because the next thing he says to her matches up with that. He says, go in peace. Go into peace. Actually, the word is into. Go into peace. Now, what's the Hebrew word for peace?
Shalom.
Shalom. And as you probably all know, that is the word used as a greeting among Jewish people. Shalom. They don't say, hi, how are you? And then don't wait for an answer. They say shalom. Peace. What do they mean by that? They just mean absence of conflict? No. The word shalom indicates the wholeness of a person, his whole being. That you're wishing that they are whole in their being, that is body and spirit. And so what Jesus is saying to her is, daughter, you who are now a member of the family of God, it's your faith that has brought you into that wholeness of relationship. And now you are enabled to go out, to go from here into a relationship of peace. And if we dig deeper into that, we would say that what is that peace? It's peace with God, it's peace with others, it's peace within yourself. And as you know, all of you who have trusted in Christ, there is a peace there that is beyond comprehension. And so there's a lot wrapped up into these few words that he says to her. Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. All right, any questions or comments?
Yeah.
There. Yeah, go ahead.
The Armenian Bible says, take heart, my daughter, your faith is giving you life. And if I remember correct, that word is sozo or something like that.
Sozo is the
which means to rescue.
Yeah.
I just thought that was an interesting
mhm,
thing.
yeah. All right, a few lessons that I've drawn from this for us. Looking at the whole passage, or the last part of chapter 8 here, thinking about back to the demons going into the pigs and comparing that to what has transpired in this section before us. That the exposure, if you remember back then, we said that it was important that the demons not just be cast out of the man, but go somewhere as a physical evidence that they no longer were in the man. Remember that? And in the same way, the exposure of the woman here in the crowd is just as important as allowing the demons to go into the pigs. Because in order for the woman to be recognized as having been healed of her bleeding, the master must pronounce her clean. And we've already mentioned that. Second, and that may be the primary lesson here for what Luke is trying to communicate to us. But it's also important to note, as some of you have pointed out, that in the midst of a busy day and a pressing crowd, Jesus took time to address the needs of a lonely, neglected, unimportant woman. With all the faces surrounding him, Jesus saw the one face that needed him at that moment and gave himself to her. William Barclay adds, God loves each one of us as if there was only one of us to love. So we can take that for ourselves to recognize that we are not alone. We're not just one of a crowd, even that God, through the Lord Jesus Christ, loves us individually. He has a love for each one of us. And then secondly, we can consider if that's what Jesus does in relationship to us, then we ought also to love one another, as John tells us. That we ought to see past the crowd sometimes and look into individual faces and see those that may need a loving touch, a loving word, an arm around the shoulder. And I think that too few times do I do that, and I suspect you as well. And then lastly, faith must be expressed in order to be efficient. In fact, salvation is tied expressly to oral expression in Romans 10:9, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. So the two things are tied closely together. 4th century church historian Eusebius gives us some additional information about this woman from later on. He says this woman was a heathen, so not Jewish, and dwelt at Panias near the source of the Jordan, where the Jordan River begins, north of the Sea of Galilee. And that in his time, that is in Eusebius's time in the 4th century, her house was still being shown. People were coming to her house, having at its entrance 2 brass statues on a stone pedestal, which she had herself commissioned. She paid to have these statues made. One represented a woman on her knees with her hands held out before her in the attitude of a supplicant. The other, a man standing with his cloak thrown over his shoulder and his hand extended towards the woman. Eusebius had been into the house himself and had seen this statue, which represented, it was said, the features of Jesus. It was said that the statue remained there until Julian, the Roman emperor, who tried to bring back the pagan gods, destroyed it and erected his own in place of it, only to see his own statue blasted by a thunderbolt from God. That's according to Eusebius, church historian. So whether all that is true or not, it certainly sounds like it was based on some fact that this woman had these statues made to always represent what had happened to her, the most important thing that had ever happened to her in her life. All right, any comments or questions? All right, let's move on to the rest of the story. I mean, that sounds like okay, that's a good end right there. Oh no, we still got the guy, Jairus waiting here. He's waiting and waiting and waiting. So we go on to verses 49 to 56. I'm calling this dead to fed. You'll see why in a minute. You don't already know. Verse 49, while he was still speaking, Jesus still speaking to the woman, someone came from, and we have supplied in my text for the house of, literally says from the synagogue official. We know he's standing right there. So the implication is from his house. So all this time, Jairus has been waiting. How difficult that must have been. And this messenger says, your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. Well, one less thing for Jesus to do. right? He puts this has died in an emphatic position. He's emphasizing. Dead is your daughter. Don't trouble the teacher. It's the same expression used back in chapter 7, verse 6. Remember there was a centurion who had a sick servant. And in verse 6 of chapter 7, now Jesus started on his way with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. In that case, the centurion was saying, Jesus, don't bother, you're too important to come. In this case, Jesus, don't bother because you can't do anything about it now. She's already dead. Little did they know, huh? Don't trouble yourself. Don't disturb yourself. Now, you got to think at that point, Jairus is really wondering about Jesus' priorities and his timing. And we often struggle with God's timing, don't we? In fact, much of faith is related to accepting God's timing for events. One daughter has been wonderfully healed. The other daughter was dead. Verse 50, but when Jesus heard this, he answered him, do not be afraid any longer. Only believe. She will be made well, or actually the word is saved again. She will be saved. Only believe. Do not be afraid, only believe. Those two are opposite one another. If you're living in fear, then you are not what? Believing. If you're living in faith, then you have no fear. You could take those antonyms for a lot of events in Scripture. In fact, almost any time you have fear taking place, it is because of a lack of faith. And Jesus even points that out to his disciples. So Jesus says, don't be afraid, only believe. She will be saved. When he came to the house, and you wonder how long that was before he got to the house? Remember, the crowd's still all around him, still got to work his way through. And the fact that Jairus is still accompanying him, showing him the way possibly, does that show us the faith of Jairus? I think so. Jairus didn't say, don't bother. It was one of his servants that said, don't bother the master anymore. Jairus is perfectly willing for Jesus to come. And Jesus came to the house, and it says he did not allow anyone to enter with him, except Peter and John and James and the girl's father and mother. Now, we see in the next verse who some of these people were. They were weeping and lamenting. So these are the professional mourners that are always ready for when someone dies. If you were a person of any importance at all, you would pay people to come and mourn at a family funeral. And apparently because this girl was dying, the mourners were put on call. And it didn't take them long. They got there before Jesus. And so they got there and they're weeping and mourning. And Jesus says, no one, I don't want anyone coming into the house except for Peter, James, and John, and the girl's father and mother. Okay, why would he do that? First of all, why would he not let anybody else in? And then secondly, why would he let these few people in? Let's ponder that for a moment. You can answer either question.
Because he didn't want witnesses about what he was about to do.
So he didn't want witnesses? But
Not like the lady,
okay, why wouldn't he want witnesses?
because it's being raised from the dead. She's being raised from the dead, maybe.
Okay,
And it's more,
Drawing too much attention.
too much attention. Okay, Jim?
I would think it'd be more that he didn't want anybody other than him and his group to take any kind of responsibility for what happens when he goes in and the girl is alive. Because the mourners and them out there can come around and say, oh, because we were at the synagogue and stuff, we caused it.
Okay, so no one else could take responsibility, all right?
I was thinking he just wanted people that have faith with him.
Okay, that's there's a point there as well. You want people who are believers in him to be there. Not the disbelievers, which we'll see in the next verse. Why not all the disciples? Why just Peter, James, and John? Why any disciples? Why not just mother and father?
It was a gift of experience for them personally.
I'm sorry, say it again.
It was a gift to those specific disciples personally.
Okay, why them? Don't be afraid to say it.
Favorites.
His favorites.
Jesus had favorites.
Well, Jesus couldn't have favorites, could he? Were there some disciples that were closer to him than others? Yeah. You know, as a teacher, there have been a lot of students through the years that, you know, you just have a natural connection with. Others think you have a natural connection and don't. I've had a lot of students think or claim that they were my favorite student. They may have been or maybe not, who knows? But we know that John describes himself as what?
Love.
Yeah. The most favorite? Is that what you said?
That's what she said.
The one that Jesus loved? Yeah.
I also think that Jesus, you know, he knew he was going to raise the child from the dead, but it was a solemn moment. You know, it was the mom and dad, he didn't want a bunch of hysteria and,
Yes.
you know, and everything. And it was a really big deal to lose a child. And that's partly of taking how the mom and dad felt into consideration, I think. And then, you know, it was about them and the whole solemn situation.
More personal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's the aspect of no one would be able to hear what Jesus is even saying with all the bedlam of the mourners and all that in there as well. But why any disciples at all?
Because he did want some witnesses.
Yes. Some objective witnesses. Mother and father might not have been too objective.
Right.
You know, because they've got some vested interest, some emotional interest. And so there does need to be some objective witnesses too, John.
I just came into my brain, there's also a weird dynamic going on here. Jesus says the Yaris, okay, just believe and she will live. So the actual vehicle for the miracle is her father, not the dead girl. And that's just the opposite of the woman. It was her faith that made her whole. Now all of a sudden it's the father's faith that's going to bring his daughter back to life. That poses all kinds of millions of questions. I don't even want to go to.
Well, and one aspect of that is that we're told before that she was, I can't remember the expression, about 12 years old. About, so she's not there yet. So she hasn't quite reached womanhood yet. So she still is under the authority of her father. So their father makes decisions for her. His faith is counted towards her because she is under his authority.
You know, I've had the unfortunate reality of being with people that are going through such depth of loss. And you know, it's a pain that you know, there's just no other pain that really compares to the loss of maybe even the sudden loss of your child.
And remember, it's his only.
Only child, yeah, I mean, it's just the depth of the grief is beyond. That, I, like what Julie was saying, I think this is really being kind to the parents,
Mhm.
really showing them knowing what he's gonna do to give them that support and that love and that moment.
Yeah, and then think about that in relationship with what John was saying too, is that all the crying and wailing would be the exact opposite of the faith of the father,
Right,
because that is because the girl has died and he's expressing faith
right.
of what Jesus said was going to happen, and so there's all that emotion is wrapped up
Yeah,
in there.
You kind of,
Yeah, no, yeah,
this
sorry.
is the time when you wonder about the full intention. We sometimes just can't 100% understand exactly what God and Jesus had intended, because he almost even diminishes the fact of her dying by saying, well, she's just asleep. You know, it's not even, I set this all up. I brought who I wanted into the room. Everyone else stay out there. We're going to do this. You know, I'm going to raise the child from the dead, but all of you stop crying. She's not dead. She's just asleep. Why are you diminished? Why was that then diminished? I mean, I know it's not a joke, obviously.
Yeah. Well, as soon as Jim has his comment, we'll go on to those verses and see what we can find there.
Yeah, well, I was thinking somewhat of what's right. You read in there, those professional mourners and stuff came. They were professional. They knew when somebody died.
Yes.
Yet you read this, and I get thoroughly lost because, no, she didn't die. She's asleep. No, they would know if she was asleep.
All right, we've got to get to the next verse here then. We're talking around it. Let's get to it. Verse 52. Now they were all weeping and lamenting for her, and the they is a crowd of people, as we said, professional mourners. So they're all weeping and lamenting. So think about that. In relationship to funerals you've been to, what's it like at funerals that you've attended? Quiet.
Well, unless it's an Irish funeral.
But that's only after the whiskey's coming out. Just kidding. But then back then it wasn't quiet. It was the exact opposite. Extremely noisy. All right, so it's very noisy.
and we see that even now. It's still culturally that way. When you see on TV and different things,
Yeah.
the expression from our perspective is just over the top. But that's the normal way if they're doing their.
Yeah, not only people wailing with their voice and stuff, but instruments, flutes playing, chords that are minor chords and stuff. It's a lot of noise.
I was
And
just
wailing.
thinking of the Iranian, the leader, Khomeini,
Mhm.
who, when he died, they were passing his body over people's heads and it ended up falling on the ground, and it's a whole different culture there.
Yeah.
It isn't our solemn. This took place in the Mideast.
So Jesus has to combat that before he even goes in. He says, "Stop weeping." Okay, why should we stop weeping? For she has not died, but is asleep. Now, why does he use the word asleep? What does sleep indicate that death does not? Yeah, she's gonna wake up. It's temporary. When you go to sleep at night, you assume that you're gonna wake up in the morning. Whereas if you died at night, you say, okay, I'm not gonna wake up. So he says she's asleep. And verse 53, and they began laughing at him for just the reason that Jim said, because they knew when somebody was dead, knowing that she had died. Now, the word knowing here is not gnosko, it's oida. They knew factually. They did not experience it. They maybe even didn't even see her, but they knew for a fact, because it had been verified by somebody, at least, they knew for a fact that she was dead. No one said she was mostly dead. She was dead. So what does the action of the mourners indicate about them? If they're laughing at what Jesus said, what's it indicate about them?
They didn't believe.
They didn't believe. They had no faith. Verse 54. So we have to kind of read between the lines a little bit here to say this. See, now he's in the room with her. The mourners are outside. He's in with her and says, he, however, took her by the hand and called, saying, "Child, arise." Now, took her by the hand. Was this action to transfer power to her, or was it simply to assist her in sitting up after she'd already been healed? Kind of lean toward the latter, because I'm not sure he doesn't need to be there even, we saw before. And I think about recently when I went to the chiropractor, and after manipulating my back and neck, he offered his hand and I took it to sit up. It was a lot easier that way. So he offers his hand, gives his hand, takes her by the hand, says, "Child, arise," and helps her sit up. And the word "arise," I don't know if you remember back when last week we were talking about the different remedies that were given by the rabbis for the healing of a woman with a hemorrhage. Remember, one of the things that had to be done, whatever remedy she was pursuing, the person administering it was to say, "Arise." The word "kom," and that's exactly the word he uses here. Now, I don't know if that was intentional on his part to use that, but it certainly is interesting that the word is supposed to be used with a woman with hemorrhaging. He did not use there, but he uses that same word here with this woman or this young lady. And we see verse 55, and her spirit returned. What's that tell us?
She's dead.
She was dead. But not in Jesus's mind, because he knows what's going to happen. But she was really dead. Because some people try to look at these miracles and say, "Oh, the person was just in a coma, or they were sleeping, whatever," and try to deny the miraculous. But she was dead, and
Well,
she
I want to
got.
throw one other thing in there. It
Yeah.
also says she has a soul, that she's just not a pile of dust and dirt.
Yeah, she has a spiritual aspect to her being.
There is
Yes.
a soul, which we don't believe anymore.
Yeah.
Perhaps the grabbing of the hand was to make sure that it was just her that was raised and not other children who might have been,
Oh, hadn't thought about that. Yeah, he is talking specifically to her. Yeah, we think about Lazarus. He called Lazarus, not everybody else. All right, so there is a separation between the physical and the spiritual that is only rectified by the resurrection of the physical. She got up immediately. It wasn't a process. Didn't have to go through a routine. And he gave orders for something to be given her to eat. Why did he say, "Bring something to eat"? Okay, good. If you look at other parts of Scripture, how does one prove that they're not a spirit? By eating. Jesus does that later after the resurrection. In the Old Testament, we see angels appearing, and I think in the case of was it Manoah, the father of Samson? He offers something to eat. The angel. Angels, no thanks. If I ate it, you'd just see it go right through me. Didn't say that, but
It lied.
it's a lie. Yeah. All right, so that's one reason to show that she's not just a spirit. That's what they should have done when Peter came to the door after they were praying for him to release him from prison. They should have said, "Give him something to eat, see if he eats it," because they said it's his ghost. Why else?
I'm sure this isn't the answer, but not only did he resurrect her from the dead and sustained life, he also sustains the stuff that provides life. And it says, give us, but probably isn't true.
Well, I thought you were heading towards,
I know, I'm off receiving.
but you went off into the weeds. Whatever it was that ailed her now is gone too.
I feel like it shows that she has physical strength. I think
Yes.
She was very weak, she died. And then usually if you're like, like you weren't really dead, you would be like super weak or not capable of doing
Mhm.
anything. But she was actually dead and Jesus healed her completely. And now she's up and eating. And
Yeah,
so
how many
that
people
shows
do you
that-
know that they're weak and dying, eat a full meal?
Yeah,
Usually not eating at all. And so that shows that her appetite is restored, her disorders removed, she could eat and drink as she had done before she was ill. So she was raised to have a living life as she had been living before, supported by eating and drinking. Godet observes it shows the perfect calmness of the Lord. When performing the most wonderful work, he acts like a physician who has just felt the pulse of his patient and gives instructions respecting his diet for the day. Holding her by the hand. Okay, you're fine now. Give her something to eat.
The compassion
Yeah.
of Christ throughout this is so beautiful.
And what's the result? Her parents were astonished, amazed. Literally, the word is they were beside themselves. But he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. What? Jim?
That this always amazes me, because he did this several times. Where he did Miracle of the Dead, so don't say anything. Now, the girl's gonna get up and go out. He really doesn't have to say anything because they're gonna see her, but it
Yeah.
just seems so odd.
Yeah, and the only reason I came up with, because he does the opposite with the demoniac that was healed. He says, go tell everybody. But here he says, don't tell anyone. And someone said that maybe it was to relieve the newly joyous parents of the obligation to go tell everybody what had happened. Don't worry about that now. You just take care of your daughter. So don't tell anybody. Knowing that the news is going to get out anyway. And he's got 3 disciples there who he's training on what to do, and also are there for verification of what had happened as well. All right, next week when we come back, we will, I wanted to talk about Elijah and Elisha too. Maybe we'll come back and kind of finish up next week a few loose ends about this particular episode and comparing it back to the widow's son being raised back at Nain, remember? We'll do a little comparison of that at the beginning of next week and then move on into chapter 9. It's been a long time coming, but we're almost there. All right. Don't forget to tune in to Discovering His Story each week on yctv.org.